Good evening. Good evening. My name is Tanya Gomez. I'm the Associate Dean in the College of Education here at EOU. And on behalf of Eastern Oregon University and the College of Education, I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's presentation. You're really in for a treat this evening. We have so many constituents here, and in the auditorium we have representatives from high school students and teachers and administrators, university faculty, staff, and students. We have community members, and we have a distance audience. This is being live streamed, and we have people as far away as Illinois that I know of who are watching tonight. And so we welcome you all to this program. And we have an amazing guest tonight, Dr. Christine Sleeter. And to introduce her, I would like to have Tanya Gomez, the director of our Center for Culturally Responsive Practices, do that introduction. So thank you, Tanya.
Good evening. Dr. Gomez stated my name is Tanya Gomez. I'm a faculty member in the College of Education, but tonight my role is the director of the new Center for Culturally Responsive Practices here at EOU. And that center is funded in part by a grant from the Oregon Educational Investment Board and the Oregon Department of Education. This evening, it's my pleasure to tell you about our guest, Dr. Christine Sleeter. She is a Professor Emerita in the College of Professional Studies at California State University, Monterey Bay, where she was a founding member. But prior to that, she was born and raised in Medford, Oregon, so we're so happy to bring her back to Oregon for all of you. She was formerly a high school learning disabilities teacher in Seattle, Washington. She served in many leadership roles in many national organizations. She was the immediate past president of the National Association for the Multicultural Education, and also vice president of the Teaching and Teacher Education Division of the American Educational Research Association. Her research is widely published. She has over 100 articles in journals and edited books. And according to Google Scholar, her work has been cited over 13,000 times. Her work has been translated into Spanish, Korean, French, and Portuguese. She's been invited to speak in most U.S. states as well as several other countries. As a matter of fact, on Sunday, she'll be flying to Sweden to do 2 presentations following her visit to LaGrande. Her work is referenced and recognized in nearly every single teacher education program across the nation, and she's been the recipient of numerous awards for the quality of her scholarship and commitment to the field of education. So tonight, I'm honored to introduce Dr. Christine Sleeter and invite her to share with you her research and practice in teaching for equity in multicultural classrooms.
Thank you so much, Tanya. And thank you so much to the Center for Culturally Responsive Pedagogy at Eastern Oregon for inviting me here. It's really exciting, actually, for me to come back to my home state to be talking with you and working with you in a professional kind of context. I am going to try something that I actually haven't really done before with a group. I have just finished writing a novel. Working. Hang on a minute. This evening has turned out to be a little bit of a comedy of errors in that I got here, realized I'd left my notes back in the hotel, and had to scramble back to the hotel to get the notes so that I could be here. But I've just finished writing a novel that's in the process of being published. I have the galley sheets that I'm working with while I'm on this trip. And I've been interested in the process of teachers learning to become culturally competent. In this novel, the protagonist, Jessica, is a second-year classroom teacher, and the novel traces her learning to become a culturally competent teacher. And I think it actually works for a novel and not just a teacher education textbook. We'll see. But you are one of the first audiences that I'm trying reading some excerpts from it, from the novel, and weaving it in among some also portraits of classroom teachers, as well as a project that I had did some work with in New Zealand. So we'll see if this works. This is why I had to run back to the hotel to get the notes, because I couldn't do a reading without the reading. Jessica's stomach sank as she anticipated a second year teaching fifth graders who seemed to come from Pluto while she hailed from Mercury. She scanned 33 new faces, about half Mexican, the rest white, most poor. Would she reach them any better this year? What did Michelle enjoy most about camping with her family? She asked about the story they had just read. Only the third day, she was still attaching names to faces. She glanced at a card taped in front of a bronze-skinned boy whose short black hair reminded her of a shoe brush. Jerome? Jerome whirled around and whispered, "Don't do that," to the boy behind him, who stifled a giggle. To Jessica, "Getting chased by ghosts?" "Ooh, ghosts of Sherwood." Alvaro, sitting behind Jessica, pantomimed drawing back a bow. They told ghost stories at night. They weren't chased by ghosts. Diana, "What did Michelle enjoy most about camping?" Jessica repeated, mentally marking the two boys to keep an eye on. "That isn't how you say her name, teacher," offered Mark, blonde hair falling across his eyes. Puzzled, Jessica looked at the name card again. "Sweetheart, how do you say your name?" "At home it's Diana, but my teachers always say Diana." She studied the page, apparently searching for the answer. "Oh, here it is. The thing Michelle enjoyed most was the river's big swimming hole." "Thank you, Diana." Jessica made a point to use Spanish pronunciation. "How many of you have been to a swimming hole?" 3 hands shot up. Before Matt could open his mouth, Alvaro burst out, "We go swimming at Lake San Antonio, teacher." Jessica's mental image of the story suddenly evaporated. Gone were the snow-capped peaks, pine forests, and waterfalls from her camping trip the week before. In their place, picnic tables rose from gravel alongside a large California reservoir, rimmed by dusty brown hills and trees too sparse to offer shade. I asked Matt, but she barely heard Matt's reply as she fixed a stern look on her face just as a book crashing to the floor snatched students' scant attention from the camping story. Okay, Jessica, this is kind of at the beginning, and she's a composite of a lot of teachers and teacher education students that I've worked with over the years. What I would like to do is explore 4 paths of teacher learning. These aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, I think teachers do best who work through all 4 of them. In the novel, Jessica does work through some of them, but I'm going to switch now to talk about another teacher here. And I'm going to start with, let's see, just going back, the 4 paths are culturally responsive curriculum and pedagogy, learning through community funds of knowledge by engaging with communities that students are from, learning through dialogue with students, and self-knowledge. So let me start with learning through curriculum and pedagogy. And I'll say just a wee bit about this book that I've written, Unstandardizing Curriculum, which I'll be using tomorrow for the workshop that I'm doing with classroom teachers. But it's a book that lays out a framework for developing and teaching multicultural curriculum. And it has in it several case studies of teachers who have been students in my graduate class in multicultural curriculum design. And I'd like to share with you a story of one of the teachers, Angela. Angela was teaching a combination 4th and 5th grade class when I had her as a student. She was a second-year teacher, actually very much like Jessica, and was teaching in a school that was a very diverse, low-income school. I don't think that there was a racial ethnic majority among the students. And it was located in a relatively poor neighborhood. And actually, many of Angela's experiences, as I got to know her over the semester, I think she was one of the people I was thinking about as I was creating Jessica and writing about her struggles. When I met Angela and had the teachers talk about what they were grappling with in school and what they wanted to learn, there were 2 things that emerged from what Angela was interested in. First, she really wanted to figure out how to engage the students in active learning in a context in which the students hadn't learned how to do active learning. And so things would get chaotic in her classroom. So she talked about, for instance, when she was student teaching, she liked to do projects with students. But when in this particular school, where nobody was using project-based learning, and she would do a project, students would, she explained that, sometimes they would throw things and, rubber bands would go sailing and stuff. Her second challenge that she worked on here, and this more emerged slowly, but how do you teach curriculum from indigenous perspectives when the textbook is not written from indigenous perspectives at all? So at the beginning of the semester, I asked all of the teachers to identify a concept that they would be teaching in another couple of months or so. And we would work on designing curriculum from a multicultural perspective for that concept. So the concept that Angela decided to work on was colonization. And she came up to me after class and said, okay, I'm going to be teaching about the 13 colonies because that's what's in our textbook. And you want us to think about our concept from a different cultural perspective. And I'm really interested in Native Americans. And what did Native Americans think about colonization? And I was like, you've never studied that before? And I was thinking of all of the writing, certainly, that's been done by indigenous people in the ethnic studies shelves in our library, and as well as in my own library. And also thinking about, from the perspective of people who have been colonized, in a way there's some things that would be sort of obvious about the colonization process, but she had never studied it before. So I said, well, okay, so that's where we start. This is going to be a learning process. So I have teachers analyze their textbooks to see from whose perspective the textbook is. We have an analysis instrument that they use. And I've analyzed the textbooks that are used in social studies in Monterey, California, where I live. And so I had a pretty good idea of how indigenous people are constructed within the social studies textbook. And this is basically it. In fourth grade, there's mention of indigenous people in California. That's when students study the state of California. In fifth grade, when they start studying U.S. history, there's a unit on pre-Columbian Indians, and then the unit sort of, everything shifts when the white people arrive, and then the story starts following the white people as they went from the East Coast to the West Coast. That by eighth grade, when they study U.S. history again, the last mention of indigenous people is when Chief Joseph surrendered, actually not too far from where we are here. And then essentially what you have is a disappearance of indigenous people from the texts, sort of paralleling the supposed disappearance of indigenous people from the U.S., which actually isn't what happened. Angela, when she analyzed her textbook, she had never been asked before to look at the textbook from indigenous perspectives. And so this was an excerpt out of her paper that she wrote about it. But it was just something that she had just never really had to think of before. So then I told the teachers that in order to be able to design good multicultural curriculum, you have to go and read. Especially if your own education background didn't give you the content, you're going to need to go and do some reading. So with all of them, I help them find, or some of them do it pretty well on their own, but a lot of them have needed help, finding material to read from the perspective of a marginalized sociocultural group about the theme that they're going to be teaching. Angela read, these were 4 of the books that she read, and she also read some additional articles. I had helped her find particularly this one, Rethinking Columbus, that's a really excellent resource for classroom teachers. But I also told her that for designing this unit, you can't just be taking the whole of North America for 500 years. That's too big. You need to narrow down to, I want you to narrow down to a time frame and a place so that you can go in some depth and not just be trying to kind of shotgun cover the waterfront. As Angela read the things that she read, she discovered a very different story emerging in the works of Native American people about U.S. history. She read about well-developed cultures in very different nations, about massive dispossession and genocide. She learned ways in which the Europeans learned from indigenous peoples, various kinds of things, democratic practices, personal hygiene, agriculture, medicine, and so forth. And she also got some glimpse into what some of the main issues are today from indigenous perspectives, particularly revolving around what it means to be semi-sovereign people and what it means to try to rebuild an economy and a political system when a lot of that has been eradicated. So then she was like faced with the challenge of, how do I put this together into a curriculum? And she came into my office one day and she said, this is really hard. She said, ideas are spinning off of each other, but I see these two opposite storylines. They're just going in two completely different directions. And a challenge I have is, for this unit, I only have 45 minutes for 3 days. And that's it, because otherwise I have to get back to the standards-based stuff. And I didn't tell her what to do. I wasn't actually sure exactly where she was going to go with it. But we talked, and then she went back to her school, and one of her colleague teachers gave her the idea of structuring the unit around a trial, which turned out to be actually a brilliant idea. So she decided to focus on the state of Massachusetts in the 1600s and have a trial in which the Haudenosaunee people, which is the League of the Iroquois, brought to trial the colonists for misuse of the natural resources. The Native American people who were in that area, there were the Haudenosaunee, the Wampanoag, and the Pequot. And for her trial, it would specifically be the Haudenosaunee bringing to trial the British colonists. She set it up and called it the Case of the Missing Deer. And she decided also to connect it with the ecology unit that she was doing for science. So on the first day of the unit, I missed the first day, but I watched the rest of it. On the first day, she gave the students background about Wampanoag and the Haudenosaunee and how a trial works, and particularly the great law, the Haudenosaunee Great Law of Peace and Good Mind, which she used as the legal framework for setting up a trial, because the Haudenosaunee did have a trial process. The second day of the unit, she had the students do a simulation of overhunting the deer population. And I came to watch this, and I could see what she meant about active learning and the students not knowing how to, it became very chaotic. And then she went back into the classroom and started teaching in this really didactic, almost punitive manner of tell me the 3 reasons, blah, blah, blah. And you could raise your hand, and she'd call in somebody, and the students were just getting really restless and starting to throw spitwads and everything. And I was like, oh, dear. I'm seeing exactly the challenges that she was grappling with. The third day was when the students role-played this trial. And it was really, really interesting. She did a super job of setting it up. She had the students in roles, and she gave, all of the students had a roll card defining who they were. There were witnesses for the Wampanoag. I guess it was the Wampanoag, not the Haudenosaunee bringing. Anyway, witnesses for the Wampanoag, witnesses for the colonists, 5 judges, and the jury. And the students role played the trial, and then when the Wampanoag and the colonists had testified, then the judges went out. The judges went out, and the jury went out, and they were deciding what to do. And the students then had questions to ask. Anyway, the whole thing in 45 minutes. The students were, what was interesting to me, the students were very highly engaged. They were thinking. They were not fooling around the way I'd seen them do the day before. They were asking good questions, and in response to written questions she gave them, they were giving some really good, thoughtful responses. What I could see Angela learning in this short unit that she developed, in this process of developing unit, were some good curriculum and pedagogy things. She learned that boring control-oriented teaching tended to bore the students and lower her own expectations as a teacher. Conversely, when she had something that was really well planned, the students were highly engaged, and the students actually appeared smarter in the classroom. But she also learned that she had to go and do a lot of reading to compensate for the prior education that she hadn't had. As I left Angela, I reflected on the fact that with the focus that she had had on curriculum and pedagogy, she developed some really useful skills. And I could see her using the skills in the classroom, and I could see a real positive response from the students. But there was a lot she still didn't know. And I didn't know if after this semester she would revert to what were becoming low expectations for the students she was teaching, because what she knew so far was mainly concentrated on good curriculum and pedagogy in the classroom. So this leads me to the next path of teacher learning that I want to consider briefly, which is engaging in communities to learn something about the funds of knowledge in communities, and particularly communities that have been historically marginalized. In these quotations, Luis Moll and Norma Gonzalez talk about what the concept of community funds of knowledge is. But the basic idea is that all communities have funds of knowledge. And even people who are very poor, you need to know things to be able to survive poverty. In their work, when they went into Mexican households, they were able to find a lot of areas of knowledge that people had. And people didn't necessarily, when you would ask, you know, what are you expert in? Well, I'm not expert in anything. But if you hung around long enough, you saw that there was a good deal of expertise in the community and in the household. As a teacher, teacher educator, I have regularly built into my classes community-based learning, because I think that's an extremely powerful form of learning, cross-cultural community-based learning, learning how to learn from the communities your students live in. Kathy was one of the teachers who was also in another section of my multicultural curriculum design class. No, she was in the same section as Angela. Yeah, okay. Anyway, Kathy was a first grade teacher, a bilingual teacher in Salinas, California. And she was a veteran teacher and understood quite a bit about curriculum and pedagogy and also about community-based knowledge. What she got out of my class was deepening her practice, and particularly her practice of building on the funds of knowledge that students brought. Kathy grew up on a farm. She designed this unit I'm going to share with you around Monterey County agriculture. And she grew up on a farm in Ohio. And as this quotation talks about, she watched her own family lose the farm as farming has shifted from individual family-owned farms to agribusiness. Her family could no longer afford the farm that had been in the family. And this led her to think about a conflict that she's talking about between what agriculture has become, in which ordinary people can't afford to own their own farms, and a world of farming in which people can make a living off of farms. And she was telling me that a lot of the families who have come to work in Salinas come from agricultural areas in Mexico, where the people basically have lost the farm or have not been able to financially support the farm because of the shifts in agriculture, driven primarily in the United States. So this picture shows the fields that are not too far from Kathy's school, where the parents of many of her students worked. In designing this unit, she was sometimes asked if she was simply preparing children of agricultural workers to become agricultural workers themselves by having a unit around agricultural work. And she said, no, the parents want them to go on. Their parents would like to see them go on to university. And I'm using this unit to try to do this. But I want to build on what's familiar to them, and I also want them to respect the work that their parents do, because they really don't know that much about what their parents do. She also, in this quotation, was talking about the fact that young children, as early as first grade, do come into school with political type questions that they're asking. Because her unit, as you'll see, does get into some political issues. And sometimes I hear people say that first graders, second graders, third graders are too young to handle political issues. And what Kathy explained is that the kids hear about political issues all the time. And they'll bring questions into the classroom about one of these was about a ballot proposition, or about the war in Iraq, or about a lot of things. And it seems like the classroom should be the place to open up those questions rather than to close them off. So this schema is for her interdisciplinary unit on Monterey County agriculture. For social studies, she anchored it in the work of the United Farm Workers. Some of the parents in her class were usually members of the United Farm Workers, or had been members in the past, and would come into the class and co-teach the union organizing part of the social studies with her. She also, with the social studies, spent some time on the nature of agriculture and comparing and contrasting large agribusiness with small family farms, and the students' experiences as they've gone between Mexico and the U.S. and what they see in terms of farming. For language arts, the students did farming, local history, writing across the curriculum kind of thing. For music, they learned labor organizing songs. And just as an aside, Kathy did have to teach to the state standards in California, and she annotated, she had this sheet where she was annotating the relationship between the standards and her curriculum. And I sometimes sort of chuckled to myself when I thought, what if one of the administrators comes in when the students are singing labor organizing songs, and she can simply point to, and here's the standard that we're teaching to. For science, the students studied plant growth, and some kids up there with their beans that they were measuring. And then for math, they studied the concepts of graphing and more than, less than. And I wanted to see for myself what she was doing in math, because often people will say, math, you can't do anything culturally responsive with math. So I went to her class and walked in, and across the board, she had a sheet kind of like this, with a line with different crops below. And for those of you who don't speak Spanish, we've got celery, flowers, lettuce, artichokes, strawberries, broccoli, working at home, and working in other jobs. She gave the students cards, and on the cards, the students were to write their name and where their parents worked, and draw a picture of where their parents worked. And then she had the students come up and put the cards where they would go. So we have a graph. And then she worked with the students on doing numerical reasoning using the graph. So first as a large group, and then the students worked in pairs where they would ask each other mathematical questions, which the way she'd constructed this turned out to be mathematical questions in relationship to where their parents worked. So how many more parents work in broccoli as opposed to in strawberries and stuff like that. And the students really got into it. It was really fun to watch. Here's an actual picture of an actual student with the actual graph. I asked Kathy if this kind of work engages the students, if they learn math better. And she was like, yeah, they do get it. They do get it. So going back to Jessica. Jessica started embarking on some home visits about a little over halfway through the novel. She's been trying some things in her classroom, but she realized that she really didn't understand the Mexican families. And so she asked, her school didn't have a policy of home visits, but she thought it would be good learning for her. So she asked her students if anybody would like to have her just come and get to know their parents at home. She'd met the parents during open house, but not at home. And to her surprise, the first person who raised their hand was Alvaro, the one who was the Ghosts of Sherwood, you know. And so she's like, okay. So I'm going to read just toward the end of the home visit. She goes, and when she gets there, she discovers that Alvaro's mother is just totally honored that the teacher is visiting the class. Is also feeling a little bit not sure about her own English. So she's invited another parent who Jessica had also met earlier to come over and do the home visit with her so that it wouldn't be entirely dependent on her English and Jessica's total lack of Spanish. So this is about 2/3 of the way through when Senora Perez, who's Alvaro's mother, has gotten out an album of photos, and they're going through the family photos and then doing some discussion around the photos. Maria Paz explained, a lot of Mexican farms used to sell crops for a fair price the farmers could live on. Now, with all this cheap American produce coming in, it's much more difficult. Her family depended on the farm. Mine didn't, you see. My family has a large ranch. One of my brothers owns it now that my parents are older. My brother works as a financial advisor for a large company. But too much American produce creates problems for farmers. Why didn't she know that, Jessica wondered, suddenly feeling ignorant. So much was missing from her own education, and from a lot of news, at least the news she was used to paying attention to. Beatriz began turning pages in the photo album, naming people as she went. My uncle and his family. She pointed to a large family standing on a patio surrounded by vegetation. My cousins Gloria and Sandra, with their children, standing in front of a large old church. With page after page, a very large extended family came into view against backdrops of living rooms, patios, distant mountains, and flower bushes. How many of these family members does Alvaro know? Jessica finally asked. All of them. He forgets some names, but he sees all of them every time we go visit, replied Beatriz. Might Alvaro or your other children go back there and live someday? She asked both women. Beatriz shrugged. They were born here. They're U.S. citizens. Maria Paz added, it will depend on where they have the best opportunities. We want our children to feel comfortable in both worlds, the one here in the U.S. and the one where most of their family still lives. We want to keep as many options open for them as possible. If they get university degrees, then they'll be in the best position to decide where they want to live. Beatriz added emphatically, we want them to have a good education. We don't want them to have to do hard work like my husband and I, cleaning and yard work, but maybe become teachers like you. Jessica tried to picture a grown-up Alvaro as a teacher. To her surprise, she realized that she could conjure up an image in which he was a lot like Esteban, who was the teacher next door to her. The hint of a smile crept across her face. This has been a wonderful visit, Senora Perez and Senora Maria Paz. You've given me so much to think about. It's nothing, Mrs. Westerfield. We're honored that you chose to visit our home, replied Beatriz Perez modestly, as though Jessica were president. Please come again. The third path that I'd like to explore briefly is learning through dialogue with students. For me, this has been incredibly important as a way of learning to teach. And it's important as teachers to think about who are the students that we have most learned not to listen to. I had the good fortune to work for several years, partly as a consultant and then as an evaluator, to a project in New Zealand that was designed specifically to help teachers learn how to listen to their Maori students, who are the indigenous people of New Zealand. And these are the project directors, and for any of you who are interested in following up on this, there have been several things published, most recently in American Educational Research Journal. The issue facing Maori students in New Zealand is very much the same as the issue facing Black and Latino as well as Native American students in the U.S. And that is that most of the students go to school in which in New Zealand they do have Maori immersion schools, but that's not where most of the Maori students are. Most of the students are in just sort of regular mainstream schools. And they generally have low academic achievement, high rates of suspension, and after about 10th grade, a lot of Maori students simply leave school. And so the researchers decided to try to figure out why, and specifically from Maori students' perspectives, what's going on at 10th grade. So they went into 2 secondary schools and interviewed Maori students, both those who were doing well and those who weren't, teachers, parents of the students, and school administrators. And this graph captures what they found. The explanations, I'll start over here. Explanations for why Maori students aren't doing well. That revolve around structure, talk about power relationships. And so the power relationships in the larger society, discrimination in the workforce, and that kind of thing. And everybody had something to say about that. Explanations that focused on the child talked about essentially what's wrong with the kids and their families as to why they're not doing well in school. Well, the kids don't care about education. They don't take education seriously. The families don't make them do their work. They don't really care about education. The relationships, the discussions that focused on relationships talked about relationships in the classroom. Study the graph. What jumps out at you? Okay, the teachers mostly talked about what was wrong with the kids and their families. The kids mostly talked about what was wrong with relationships, and particularly relationships with their teachers. Whoa. So the researchers decided to develop a professional development program for teachers that would involve teachers in learning how to learn from their Maori students. The way the Maori students saw the problem, these were some examples of quotations from the students. But, people think we don't know how to behave, or the teachers never make a sufficient effort to actually get to know us, to know where we're coming from. And when they asked the students what would they like to see going on in the classroom, the students basically talked about these things. They wanted good relationships with their teachers. They wanted a curriculum that was relevant to them. They wanted intellectually challenging work, and that was also meaningful. They didn't want stuff dumbed down, but they wanted the teacher to actually explain what they weren't understanding. And they wanted socio-cultural or active learning processes to be used in the classroom. They didn't want to just sit there. They wanted to be able to actually do things and talk with their peers and work with their peers on things. So the way the professional development project worked is that the schools would vote on whether or not they wanted to be a part of this project. The name of the project is a ministry-funded project called Te Kotaitanga. And you'd have to have a sufficient number of people, including the principal, that would vote to participate. Because they said we're not going to take individual teachers out and then send them back into schools that haven't changed. We're going to try to change the whole culture of schools so that they're responsive to the students who are in the schools. And so each of the schools then that participated would get an in-school facilitator, which was a classroom teacher who had some knowledge of culturally responsive teaching and some knowledge of things Maori. And that teacher would then end up being the lead person doing the professional development in the school. The first professional development workshop was a 3-day retreat in what they call in New Zealand on the marae, which is Maori cultural space. And people would go spend the night there. And for a lot of the non-Maori teachers, it was the first time of actually being in Maori cultural space for a period of time. And that in and of itself was kind of like, sort of make people start to, kind of think differently. But then after that, they go back to the schools, and the facilitators would then observe each one of the teachers about once a month using a observation form that looked for evidence of culturally responsive pedagogy the way it had been defined in this project in the classroom, and looked for the engagement of Maori students and things like how close did the teacher stand to the Maori students. Because a very common pattern would be that the teacher would either stand up in front or physically position herself close to the European New Zealand students, but not the Maori students. So they would look for things like that. And then after the observation, sit with the teacher and analyze the data collaboratively, and then help the teacher think, okay, next time when you come next month, what do we want to work on? And that was really the heart of the project, but the project, really the linchpin of it was getting the teachers to talk with their Maori students, and not just get to know them like, what do you like to do on the weekend, although that's important, but learn how to co-construct what happens in the classroom with the students, to give the students a voice and learn how to shift the pedagogy so that it was actually fitting the students. The project turned out to be one of the most fascinating professional development experiences I've ever been a part of. And it made a huge impact on the teachers. We went into 33 schools that had been a part of the project and sat in classrooms, observed 300 and something classrooms, did focus group interviews with teachers, students, and stuff, looked at student achievement data, student attendance data, and that stuff like that. The teachers, these were just two quotations from the teachers, but the teachers were hugely enthusiastic about it once they got over having somebody come in the classroom and observe them. And it was partly just getting help from an in-school facilitator, but it was also helping somebody break down the wall between themselves and their Maori students, and helping them learn how to translate what they were learning from the conversations with students into the teaching process so that they could be better teachers. The students also, when we interviewed them, had really positive things to say about their teachers, their relationships with the teachers, their experiences in the classroom. The student attendance went up, students stopped dropping out, and student achievement in many areas of their curriculum also went up, and particularly Maori student achievement. So this third area of dialogue with students I find incredibly important. Not the only thing, because as the teachers in New Zealand discovered, you can have dialogue with your students, but then if you don't know how to translate that into curriculum and pedagogy, like with the Angela example, then it kind of doesn't really go anywhere. So these things all need to work together. The fourth area for teacher learning is self-knowledge. In this quotation, Geneva Gay and Kipchoge Kirkland talk about the incredible importance of knowing yourself as a cultural being and as a historicized being, as a classroom teacher. And I can think of somebody like Jessica, who learned some good pedagogy, who did home visits with her students, who learned how to do some dialoguing with her students and co-constructing some of what she did in the classroom with students. And she was still not clear about culturally responsive pedagogy and where she fit into the whole area. Very often when I've worked with white teachers, it's like multicultural education is about them. And I'm white, and so I guess I'm not really that cultural, you know? And Jessica is kind of grappling with this in the book. When I'm working as a teacher educator, I work with teachers in 3 areas in self-knowledge. One of them is learning about yourself as a cultural being, and the fact that we're all culturally constructed. Everything we do is culturally constructed. And oftentimes we just haven't learned how to identify ways in which we are cultural beings. I also work with teachers around self as situated within relations of power. So that would be, for example, with white teachers coming to understand how racism benefits us in everyday life, or with how gender benefits men and not women, and how just when you walk out of a building, people start interacting with you differentially based on who they see you as being. I also increasingly, over the last few years, have been looking at this one of self as historically located. And by that I mean that all of us have a history that's a part of the history of this country that very often we don't know very much about. Now, in the case of Jessica, she knew her family back through about her grandparents, and that's about it. So culturally, she described herself as white bread. In the book, one of her friends calls her Miss Wonderbread, and then realizes that that's probably not exactly the way she wants to think of herself. But she does think of herself as white bread. And so she starts in the book doing some family history research based on discovering this old letter and wanting to know where it came from and if she was related to the people that wrote it. But in the process of that, she discovers that she had many of her ancestors on the German side of her family she discovers these bilingual, bicultural communities that existed in the Midwest in the 1800s up through the end of World War I. And this is actually my story. This part of the novel is based on my own family history research. So you get to know these two families, one of which was situated in the area around Decatur, Illinois, and the other which they kind of moved around in Illinois and Iowa because the husband was a minister, a German Methodist minister, and so he kept getting, transplanted from one place to the next. But as she got to know these families, and particularly the families as very specifically bicultural, bilingual families, and for many of us who are white, this isn't a part of our own stories that we've ever learned. But then Jessica gets up to, as she's reading, up to what happened during World War I. And in World War I, when the U.S. went to war against Germany, the amount of violent suppression of German language and culture was just incredible. And along with that, the memory that these bilingual, bicultural communities had ever existed also got suppressed. So as a kind of a winding down here, I created a scene where Jessica's great-greats, as she called them, one family, who are second-generation German Americans, decided not to pass on anything German to the kids. So this is essentially why Jessica doesn't know her own history and thinks all she is white bread. Well, that's it. Ralston slapped the newspaper onto the worn kitchen table. German's gone from Iowa. He pointed at the chicken Mamie was deboning. That's baked chicken or whatever you do to it. You're not fixing Hähnchenschnitzel anymore. Mamie replied as she continued working on the chicken. For all intents and purposes, German's been gone from here for a while, at least outside people's homes. The German Methodist Church over in Flood Creek stopped using it some months ago. Ralston, 8 years a physician in Rockford, slumped down wearily. I know. A couple of my patients told me. Gretchen is distraught. They've banned the very language that connects her with the world. But unless it's absolutely necessary to use German to communicate with a patient, we need to use English all the time. Otherwise, people start to think we're pro-German spies. Mamie sighed. I keep thinking about Dad and how he's put his whole life into building the German Communities Church. Now his life's work is being eradicated right before his eyes. I think it's slowly killing him. Ralston stood and looked out the window at auburn-haired Bobby digging a hole with a stick, dirt flying in what would soon become a vegetable garden. Their 2-year-old napping in the other room occasionally grunted. We can't tell the children about this, Ralston remarked. It's best if they grow up not knowing what happened. They're just plain white bread. I guess we are too now, for that matter. White bread. She gazed at a golden loaf she had just pulled from the oven minutes ago, filling the kitchen with its rich yeasty aroma. I guess that will have to do. Anger tinged his voice. It's still hard for me to believe people think Germany's actually trying, this is all true really, Germany's actually trying to colonize the U.S. by planting spies over here to work for the Kaiser. Poor elderly Mrs. Licht. Can you imagine anyone actually thinking she's a spy? She can barely walk across a room. Mamie said, almost half the people in this town are of German ancestry. No one I know supports the Kaiser. Ralston put his arms around Mamie's waist. We'll get through it. We will, yes. I'm not so sure about the older people like Gretchen and Mom and Dad who can't simply hide their Germanness. Looking at Bobby tossing dirt, Mamie added, Do you think they'll want to know, when they're older? Can't think why they would. He looked at her, resignation in his eyes, giving way to something less defined as he gazed off over her shoulder. We'll just tell them one of their grandpas was a farmer in Iowa, and their other grandpa was a preacher. That's all they need to know. We have a few pictures we can show them. Kids usually don't want to know many more about that anyway. But it turns out that by the next generations, they did want to know about it. So a project I've been working on that I've had some opportunity to work with teachers. I'm retired from the university now, but I did teach a class last summer working with this. I call critical family history. The book, White Bread, kind of brings critical family history to life. But on my website, oh dear, didn't mean to do that. Okay, but on my website, I have a blog that has a whole lot of stuff related to doing your genealogy and then putting it into the critical family history, which really places your family history in a larger historical, socio-cultural context. And when Jessica, as well as I think the teachers I worked with this summer, engaged in this process, then instead of seeing herself as outside multicultural education, she was able to see herself as part of multicultural education. And in the process, really learn much more deeply how to become the teacher, the culturally responsive teacher that her students actually needed. Thank you.
All right. It's been an honor and privilege having Dr. Sleeter on campus today, and tomorrow she'll be with our practicing teachers in the K-12 workshop. Currently, there should be some evaluations being handed out, or we would really like your feedback. So if you could take a few moments to give us your feedback on that. And then we have refreshments in the foyer, and we ask you to continue the conversation. If you could move it to the foyer, there's coffee, tea, and cookies for you. In 10 minutes, anybody associated with Oregon Teacher Pathways, our students from Milton Freewater, mentors, and teachers will join right down here to meet with Dr. Sleeter.